screen. So I don't see Victoria anymore.
Yeah, I'm here. I'm trying to set up the live YouTube because it
Oh,
was not
great.
first. Yeah,
That's probably why.
yeah. I'm really sorry about that. All right. So let's refresh. Hi everyone. This is Dr. Victoria Nalule, and here with me is Miss Catherine and Professor Reto. And today's webinar is about the status of charcoal in the energy transitions era. And this is part of the African Energy Book Project. And we already launched the book on the 22nd of May. But however, today we want to really go into detail with the topic or chapter with respect to charcoal, because this is a very important topic considering the fact that over 70% of people in rural areas, especially in African countries, do still rely on charcoal as a form of energy. So without wasting any time, I would like the presenters to briefly introduce themselves. So I'll first let Ms. Catherine Nabukalu to introduce herself, and then afterwards, Professor Reto Giere will also be able to introduce himself. And after that, we shall have Catherine lead the discussion on the status of charcoal, and then including giving us a brief overview of how charcoal is being used in sub-Saharan Africa, and also the challenges with respect to charcoal use alongside modern energy. And also Professor Reto will also be able to introduce himself and come in with a discussion on charcoal use in the energy transition era. So Catherine, please go ahead and introduce yourself.
So as the host just mentioned, I'm Catherine Nabukalu, and my expertise is in supply chain management. So business systems, I'm very interested in how products go from one point to another and how they increase value just by transportation or production. I'm also an energy an energy expert now from charcoal, really interested in charcoal because it moves just like other products, quite unique to other forms of energy such as petroleum and hydro and even nuclear. So my focus now is on charcoal as an energy resource, as we've said, and how charcoal is being moved around the continent, or if not the whole world, as an energy product.
All right, thank you very much for that. Professor Reto, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Reto Giere. I'm a professor of Earth and Environmental Science at the University of Pennsylvania here in Philadelphia. And I'm very excited about this project, and charcoal has become a really exciting topic for me. I learned mostly from Catherine and from her fieldwork that she did while she was a master's student in our program. And we have learned so much by doing this work and are happy to share this knowledge with you.
All right, thank you very much for the introduction. Now we shall go on to start on the discussion of charcoal, the status of charcoal use in sub-Saharan Africa. And I understand, Professor Reto, you would like to go first with this discussion. Is that so?
Okay.
For the speaking slots. So you can share your slides. I've enabled you to be able to share the slides, and then we can start the discussion depending on how you want to discuss.
Okay, great.
Right. Do you see my screen now?
Yes,
Yeah.
we can see the screen.
All right. So I just would like to start first by showing you a little bit the amount of charcoal that is produced globally. What you see there in the upper left diagram in figure A is the total production of charcoal around the entire world. And you see specifically now in our context, Africa is in the center, and you see almost 25 million tons of charcoal are produced every year. That's an annual average over a long period of time from 1993 to 2017. And so these 25 million tons represent about 57% of all charcoal that is produced globally. And so this is an enormous amount of charcoal, especially if you consider that charcoal is very lightweight. So this represents a huge volume of charcoal as well, because the weight is so low. And if you look at the second diagram on the right, diagram B, you see this diagram shows the top producers, and it shows values in million tons. And you see that in sub-Saharan Africa, there are a couple of countries that are really important, but also one other country, namely Egypt, which was a big surprise for us when we started to work on this. So when you see Nigeria, for example, 3.5 million tons of charcoal are produced in Nigeria. And the interesting thing about this is that Nigeria has a ban on producing charcoal from freshly cut trees. So, and yet it is the second largest producer in the world. Ethiopia, very similar. And then lastly, besides Ghana, Egypt is in there. And Egypt was the big surprise because, as you know, most of you know, Egypt is not known for tropical forests. So this is an example where charcoal is produced locally in an area that does not have so many forest resources. And I think I'll leave it at that for now, and perhaps Catherine could elaborate a little more.
Right. On this slide, on these diagrams.
Yes.
Yes. Right. I would like to. What I would like to really point out as well is a lot of these countries are also participating in export. So if you look at the country like Nigeria, they are also one of the world's leading exporters of charcoal. So they're already serving their local population, which is relatively, which is the most populous country in the world. They're serving that local population with charcoal, and the burden is also on their forests, extending to international supply, which means that Nigeria's charcoal production is really unique because it's really depleting their forests in a very fast way, but also it's almost hard to track because they cannot. These numbers are really big estimates because the charcoal supply chain is incredibly informal, and it's hard to track where all this charcoal goes.
If you look at the diagram C, you also notice Somalia is on there with 84,000 tons that are exported globally. And that is another surprise that we found because Somalia is mostly semi-arid or has a lot of bushland, but it's mostly not tropical forest, and yet it exports a large amount of charcoal. It was one of the top exporters. And even though there's a ban on the export from that country. So there's a lot we learn about how charcoal is traded and how some laws are basically violated because it's a commodity that is so sought after around the globe.
And probably the last highlight on that part C of that diagram, so the purple that you're seeing, is that Namibia is also quite similar to Egypt. They're also located in the Kalahari Desert, which means that their trees are not growing, that easily, at least not as easily as they would in a rainforest area like Congo. But still, once again, their charcoal is going to industrial, is serving in the heavy industry and household energy needs.
So perhaps as a final statement about these four diagrams here, these show that charcoal is actually a very important energy resource, one that cannot be underestimated. And so we have to talk about its production and its impacts, and also as part of the supply chain. And Catherine is the expert on the supply chain.
Right. So the most upstream part of the charcoal supply chain is incredibly unique because it's highly informal. There are a lot of production bans, and charcoal production happens very manually. So producers cut trees with manual tools like pangers and axes, and then they pile the logs together to form an earth mount kiln. The thing about this type of technology is that it's not really sophisticated. So they produce trees right near the tree trunk, and once they're done transforming that into charcoal, they would simply move on to other regions. So there's not a concern about reforestation because they most of the time do not own the land where they produce charcoal. Moreover, when when the charcoal production happens, it's usually in very remote areas that even though there are production bans upstream, it's really hard for governments to implement because usually the communication routes, such as transportation links, are really hard to get to.
So the production of charcoal, as Catherine said, is done mostly remotely and a lot, very often on private lands. And that is a unique process that is used in many countries. Actually, it's in earth mounds, so relatively simple stoves. So these are not stationary. In some countries, we have stationary facilities, but in Uganda, for example, it is mostly simple charcoal mounds where it is produced, and the process from normal tree trunks to charcoal is a process we call pyrolysis. And that's when the wood is transformed into charcoal in the absence of oxygen. Because if you have oxygen present, you actually burn the trees. And this is what you want to avoid. And so what happens is you get rid of a lot of the organic materials, but especially the volatile fraction and the moisture, and you turn it into what we know as charcoal, which then is the actual energy resource. It's a complicated process that is done in a simple way, but then you have to transport it to the city centers where it is mostly used.
I
Perhaps, please go ahead.
uh, no, I was going to move on to the next slide, but if you had something else to add on this one, it would be really interesting to see.
Just perhaps a short comment on figure D, top
Right.
10 importers. You see where the charcoal is going globally. And there are some countries on there, for example, Germany as the largest importer is not producing any or very, very small amounts. So this is truly an international trade. And so even though many sub-Saharan African countries use a lot of charcoal and it's an important energy resource, the charcoal is also used extensively in very industrialized countries where we would not expect it to be used so much. That was another very fascinating finding, and particularly that in these countries, the European countries, but also the UK as well as the US, a lot of that charcoal that is consumed is actually coming from Africa.
Yes, that is true. And also there's an expectation that electricity will actually be what is replacing charcoal. But as it was mentioned in figure D, really the electricity, there are countries which have consistent electricity supply, which are still using charcoal. And maybe not depending on it as a key element of energy household consumption, but they're using it for leisure. So a lot of it is imported for leisure, and you might think that is not significant as it is in Africa, because it's in Africa it's almost a necessity. But when you look at the amount of charcoal being imported into these countries, really it's a burden still on forests.
Yes. So Catherine, should I move to the next slide?
Yes, that would be great.
And so this is a slide from Power Africa. It's from the annual report. And Catherine wanted to tell you a little bit about some developments in Africa and the importance of charcoal in these.
Yes, so here we have a map of Africa, and the yellow represents all these countries that are part of the Power Africa Consortium. They have invested in, private businesses, financial institutions, and also governments. They've come forward to really increase electricity around the continent. And for this, for now, the goal is up to 60 million homes, more connections to the grid by 2030. So the red dots represent not the size of the project, but the size of the energy output, which have financially closed as of last year as of 2019. And here we see, as we saw on the last slide, countries that are really producing charcoal are also big, also at the forefront of this effort. You look at Nigeria, is producing, it's, they're committed to producing, some of the most electricity. It's only second to South Africa at over 3,000 megawatts. On the side, in the eastern side, we have Tanzania, which is also one of the world's biggest producers, as we saw before. Kenya as well, other countries, you have Ghana in there. So really there's an effort to replace or supplant charcoal by providing more electricity. But our question here is then, is charcoal going to be replaced by electricity completely? Because a lot of times consumers buy charcoal because sometimes it's linked to the taste of food, and it's convenient to some markets. It's so ubiquitous too that consumers find it reliable. So it's an interesting phenomenon here, because we're looking at how consumers really make everyday energy choices in their households. Does more availability increase the likelihood of choosing this type of energy? You're looking at Europe, where there's a lot of electricity, which is reliable, but there is still charcoal being used as an input. So we're posing the same question here for these African nations. Is more electricity really going to supplant charcoal or biomass, especially in the rural areas where the biggest target is?
So there's some estimates also that charcoal will not go away in the next 10, 20 years. It is so popular, as Catherine said, that many efforts by governments are futile in this respect, because people will just continue to use charcoal because it's convenient and has many advantages.
And perhaps one more country where we should point out on this slide, it's not really highlighted here in Power Africa, but again, Egypt. Its energy sources are already diverse. So it's not as if Egypt has, has a real need for charcoal, like in their energy mix. They have a lot of hydro energy. No, Egypt is using hydro energy from the Aswan Dam. They're using natural gas. And Egypt is really coming forward into, by investing in waste to energy, where, they're using byproducts from the agriculture sector and trying to channel them into charcoal production. But most of this is minimal because, again, there's little investment, and there's been some efforts in Kenya, Zambia, to really move on from cutting trees to produce charcoal, but there is still charcoal production.
So the last point is actually also very interesting, and I think for the future an important point, that charcoal can be produced from waste materials, agricultural waste in particular, and that could fuel the charcoal supply chain without harming trees or harming forests. And so that would give a totally new perspective, yet the investment is not very high. And on the other hand, there is a lot of agricultural waste that could be used instead of thrown out or turned into biogas. One could turn it into charcoal, which then would provide the charcoal that is so loved by so many millions of people. Should we move to the next slide, Catherine?
Yes.
So here we have again some interesting facts about the top 10 producers and top 10 exporters. And you see, it doesn't surprise that, for example, Brazil is the world's largest producer, because obviously they have huge areas of forest. And but others, such as Egypt, don't. And when you look at the top 10 exporters, you have, in a way, a similar picture. Indonesia, with very large forest resources. We hear these reports how the forests are being used for various purposes, like for not just for producing charcoal, but also for creating new agricultural areas. So sometimes the deforestation that is associated with it is going along with generating new agricultural land. And that's something that Catherine has also observed in Uganda.
Right. Perhaps one of the things I would point out here is that the charcoal production is not only moving, from Africa to Europe or from Africa to Africa. There's a lot of trade that's going on within the African continent. You have charcoal going from Nigeria to Cameroon, right? Which is really difficult to track because it's such an informal supply chain. And because the product is illegal upstream, there's a lot of ways to get around it. And it's really hard to quantify in this case because sometimes it's classified as a wood product instead of charcoal, but it's still charcoal really moving across borders. And in Europe, you have Poland as a really big supplier to other countries that are demanding charcoal. So you're seeing Africa here as a supplement, like producing more supplement charcoal to what Poland is already locally supplying. And in some cases, there's a focus on using current charcoal species for charcoal production, especially in Cuba, where there's an open trade for charcoal to come from Cuba to the US unrestricted. And it is coming in since about 3 years ago. So some of these trade restrictions are allowing charcoal to go from one country to another.
Also, for the UK imports a lot of charcoal. Some of it is directly from Africa, but also some is coming from Spain, and Spain is a big importer as well. So some of the charcoal imported into the United Kingdom might actually come ultimately from Africa rather than from Spain. So it's just transferred in Spain. And this is also true for other countries that are involved in the trade. So very often it's hard to follow the exact trade route, and which produces another issue that it's very difficult to get reliable numbers on both the amount and also the value of the charcoal trade as a whole. The other aspect we wanted to talk about is a diagram that shows the amount of forested area relative to land area. And these are this diagram shows the top 10 charcoal producing countries. And Catherine wanted to talk a little bit about this diagram because it tells us a lot about the problem of charcoal production.
Right. So in this diagram, the green represents the amount of forests that are local to these countries, and then the brown under the green represents the forest area, the land area. So basically, what you have here is the proportion of forests to land area as of 2017. So for example, if you look at Brazil is more than 50% forest because of the Amazon, for example. Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo, is also more than 50% forest. And these are really tropical forests because, there's heavy rain and they're most of the time growing naturally. But if you look at a country like Nigeria and Ethiopia or Ghana and Egypt, for instance, these countries barely have any forests within their borders. Yet somehow all these countries are the top 10 not only charcoal producers, but some are finding themselves in the list of the total top 10 exporters. So if you look at Egypt, once again, as Rita said, it's almost in the desert. It's really close to the Saharan desert. And Ethiopia as well is semi-arid. And yet there's really they barely have any forests, and yet they're topping the list in charcoal production. And not only to serve their local populations, but also international markets.
And this is an important point that Catherine just made, that some of these semi-arid areas are among the top producers in the world. And you can imagine that producing this charcoal from living trees obviously has a huge environmental impact. And it contributes to the degradation of forested areas, sometimes total deforestation even. And so charcoal has an enormous impact if you look at it in terms of the global supply chain. And yet the labels on charcoal that you buy in, let's say, in the UK or the US or Europe, typically doesn't tell you where the charcoal is coming from. So the consumer does not have a good grasp on the situation. So the consumer does not really know where it's coming from, how it is sourced, is it sustainably produced, which is very difficult to do anyway, but because it's so poorly controlled, typically when you buy charcoal, you don't know where it's coming from and what the laws were and how it got out of the producing country and into the consumer country.
Right, and there is some literature that's talking about charcoal. I mean, these tropical forests regenerating when charcoal is extracted from them. Now, there is that is an interesting phenomenon because sometimes if harvesting is done properly, the trees might regenerate. However, from the fieldwork that we did, we found that most of these trees that are cut down for charcoal are nearly 30 years old. So imagine cutting 100 trees and then counting on them to regenerate. Over a longer period of time. These are different species. Charcoal is mostly cutting trees down for charcoal is mostly indiscriminate because most trees can make charcoal. Well, there are some preferred species based on their calorific content or based on how based on where they're growing. For instance, trees that grow in more island climates might have softer stems and the trees might not be desirable. But if you look at if you look at a country like Egypt or Somalia, they have acacia, which is really desired as a raw material for charcoal, and these are really getting depleted because there is a specific focus on harvesting them, and a lot of these trees are actually flagged as endangered species, at least by the World Bank and UN.
And that is really troublesome if you think that, yes, maybe in tropical forest, the regeneration is faster, but a lot of the charcoal is coming from savannas or bushlands, semi-arid areas. And as Catherine mentioned, the acacia is a tree that grows extremely slowly. And so if you remove trees from these semi-arid areas, it takes much, much longer to regenerate, if at all, because by removing the trees, this has an important effect also on the meteorological systems, including precipitation and, of course, on a long-term climate change and desertification. So this supply chain actually enhances the negative effects of removing trees. It's just going into vulnerable areas that are really not well equipped to regenerate.
Right. And in addition to that, charcoal is only one part of the burden in terms of energy-related forest loss, because you have all these countries that are relying on charcoal also using firewood because it's much cheaper than charcoal. In some cases, it's free because people are picking it from, again, private farms where the charcoal is being where the charcoal is being produced. So in most of these cases, you're looking at countries that are also leading in terms of urbanization, like Nigeria. It's increasingly getting urbanized. Ghana is increasingly getting urbanized, and yet they're also using these forests for these purposes. They're using them for boat building. They're using the tree, the timber from there for construction. They're using this timber for other sectors as well. So charcoal is significant still because not only is it serving their local populations, but also there are other sectors that are relying on these forests.
Yes, so overall, this is contributing to the deforestation, and very often one is not aware of it, or one doesn't think about where this is coming from. So it's an important issue that has to be valued and incorporated, and particularly with increasing urbanization, there will be an increase in the supply or the increase in the demand of charcoal. So it's not going away anytime soon, while at the same time contributing significantly to the degradation of important ecosystems around the globe.
Right. So I think another interesting country that I wanted to really point out in here is Brazil. So Brazil has one of the most electricity coverage in South America because they have almost widespread electricity, reliable electricity in the country because they have different sources. But Brazil has consistently used charcoal for the heavy industry. So that is a lot of pressure on the Amazon because they're using that charcoal they're extracting a huge amount of charcoal to be used in the iron ore industry. So that's a huge burden on the Amazon considering that same area is still deforested for agriculture. And another risk that I would perhaps point out that is shared across the board, as we saw on the second slide before with the Power African investments, these these countries that are producing as much charcoal also happen to be investing in hydro. So if that charcoal production really does impact their rainfall cycles, it will impact how much output they're getting from hydro. So they have an interest in maintaining their rainfall supply by keeping their trees, because the less rain they have, the less their reliability will be for other energy sources, other electricity sources like hydro. So there's a lot of weather dependency in the new, better, modern energy systems, but these also some of them rely on having constant amount of rainfall.
All right, maybe you can give us the concluding remarks so that I open the session up for discussion. That means you can summarize.
All right.
Catherine?
So, right. So in summary, there's a lot of chocolate being produced on the African continent, but not all of it is used there. A lot of it is moving to Europe. It's going to the Middle East. It's going to different parts of the world, because this chocolate specifically grows in Africa, and it's preferred because of its calorific content. At the same time, because the production side is illegal, a lot of the supply chain is being done, almost in a stealth way, because they cannot easily track it. So a lot more charcoal is produced in the world than what we even know, because the tracking is simply difficult. And the question of whether electricity or modern energy alternatives is going to replace charcoal is still up there, really, because we have countries, nations, and even continents that have transformed their energy alternatives by diversifying them, but they're still purchasing charcoal in large amounts.
All right. Thank you very much for the brilliant presentation. I must note that charcoal is a very important topic, or it's a very important form of energy in Africa, and yet it's the least discussed on the continent and globally, including literature. We don't really have a lot of literature addressing key issues with respect to charcoal production and charcoal use. So my question would be, where do you see the future of charcoal use in the energy transition era? Because as you have mentioned in your presentation, it has various negative impacts, including it's associated with deforestation, and not to mention the indoor air pollution. Because I know, like in Southern Africa, in SADC, they mentioned that over 1,000 people die from indoor air pollution. And also, charcoal use is also contributed to gender inequalities, considering the fact that women are the main users of energy in Africa. So where do you see charcoal use in the energy transition era? I'll address, that's the question for Reto. And then Catherine, maybe you can take us through the aspects of gender inequalities that are stimulated because of charcoal use, because they say energy access is it's gendered, in that women are the main users of energy in Africa. So how is the use of charcoal likely to escalate gender inequalities in the extractive sector or in the energy sector? That's for you, Catherine. And then Professor Reto can take us through the aspects of charcoal use in the energy transition era. Where do we see it? Will we still rely on this charcoal? And I've promoted some of the participants to be panelists. So feel free to raise any questions or to make comments after Catherine and Professor Reto have responded to the questions. Thank you.
Thank you for this question. And so the future of charcoal is actually not going to change very much, I think, right now. It might even increase the use, because it is used privately so often. And so this is very hard to change habits of people. It is a very convenient fuel. So this will not change in the future, I believe, especially not with increasing urbanization. and being used mostly for cooking. But on the industrial side, it is also used for mining or for actually transforming the ores into metals, for example, and in the silica trade or also in the steel trade. So charcoal is a very useful product where we need a huge amount of charcoal. The alternative would be coke that is produced from coal. So it's kind of a trade-off between coal and charcoal. So whatever is more easily available will be used. And so this is why Namibia is so important, because they supply their charcoal to South Africa, where we have a lot of iron ore processing and also silicon generation. So it will remain a very important part of the energy mix. Yet very often we don't even know it's there because it doesn't show up in official statistics in most countries.
Please do address, Catherine, please do address your question, and then
Right.
we shall hear from the participants.
Right. So the question of gender in the charcoal supply chain is actually very important, and I'm very glad you asked, because as you look at the charcoal supply chain, it's structured in a very interesting way, where you have more men on the production side, right? Because there's a lot of heavy lifting of these logs and piling them to form the earth mount kilns, and it's very male dominated in the high in the production side. We did find some women that are part of the process, but we found that women are more, you would find more women in the charcoal supply chain as you go downstream. So they are the middlemen in the charcoal supply chain. They're selling charcoal across the road. They are the ones in the final market, really selling charcoal to the final buyers. They are the negotiators. They are also in households the major the major preparers of food, like in the case of Africa, because there's a lot of, as you said, Victoria, in the beginning, more women are producing food. The issue with this is that all along the supply chain. So it doesn't really matter for men or women, because charcoal starts to disintegrate under pressure all the way from production, all the way from harvest. So that means everybody, men and women, are all breathing in the charcoal dust. They are all exposed from the very beginning. Um, the men are exposed to the gases on the production side, because a lot of them are even sleeping near these arc mount kilns in the forest. So there's a lot of exposure to these gases. So that's the very high risk for the men. But as you go down, more people are breathing in charcoal, more people are breathing in gases as you burn the charcoal. So it's really affecting everybody around the supply chain.
And that is very similar also to wood, which is the other big biomass that is burned. And it is around the globe, in most countries, it is still a fact in countries that use charcoal or wood, that the cooking is, in the majority of cases, done by women. So the women, especially if they do it indoor, they are exposed disproportionately to the gases and the dusts, the emissions, the mercury emissions that are emitted during the combustion of charcoal or wood. So it affects women much, much more than men. And this is a big problem. And the World Health Organization knows about it, but it's hard to actually curb because of the extensive use of both charcoal and wood. And unfortunately, it does affect women much, much more on the consumer side than men.
Right. And as Rita has mentioned, what affects women most likely also affects children, because women are in most cases, the caretakers of children, and they're always most of the time around them. And when the cooking areas overlap with playgrounds, basically, you would have more poisoning. And there was a study that was done in Kampala, in Katanga, where more children whose parents were doing, participating in indoor cooking, almost had lead poisoning in their blood. Although this was not specifically linked to charcoal, there is a real risk here, because we know that indoor air pollution is a real risk from using charcoal.
And
All
one
right.
of the big, sorry.
So, sorry, Reto, maybe if you can summarize.
Just in relation to the cooking, one of the most important things we can do and suggest people to do and educate people all over the world is if you use charcoal or wood for cooking, do it outside. It has to be in a very well ventilated area, because if we don't do that, the indoor areas are completely polluted, and some of these fumes are highly toxic.
Yes.
So that's like an immediate suggestion, and it will have immediate benefits. If people who use that for cooking, please do it outside where we have ventilation.
All right. So I'll open the discussion up to the participants. Deng, would you want to comment or say something?
Um, Thank you, Professor and Catherine. I really enjoy this. I did not know that charcoal is that big business, and it's huge. I came from a country whereby charcoal is the only source of energy. I'm from South Sudan, but it looked like people are not interested in getting to know what are the impact, what are the consequences, where they're just cutting trees and it's all that it was survival, but now it's a big business. So what do we do? So I'm really amazed. I'm really happy to know much about it.
Thank you, Dan. And yeah, would you like me to comment on that?
No, I think any other participants would like to say a few words before we do the closing remarks by Catherine.
Okay.
I see Pauline online. I see Terry. I see Drover. Anyone who would like to make a comment? If not, then I'll let Professor Reto and Catherine do their closing remarks. But before that, anyone else besides Deng who would like to make a comment about this very important topic?
Hello.
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you for the presentations and of course organizing the webinar. My name is Ziwa Illington. I'm the Managing Director at Green Bioenergy. We produce charcoal briquettes, about 60 tons per month in Uganda. I'm just curious from Victoria and then the professor, what are some of the interventions that you think the different countries are implementing to address such issues, or do the countries not see any issues around the export or the production of charcoal? On a global perspective, of course, I know coming from an SME that we're producing briquettes, that can be a solution, but I'm just curious with a global perspective, what are some of the solutions? Thank you.
Yes, Reto, would you like to address that?
Okay, so there are various initiatives, and from individual governments. And we talked about, for example, Nigeria, where the production of charcoal is banned, but it still happens, and many other countries have that. In some cases, it is international organizations that actually monitor that. Most particularly for Somalia, where the United Nations Environment Program has a report on the charcoal production and especially the export. And so the international organizations, as well as some governments, try to curb the use and the trade of charcoal. But because so much of the supply chain is informal and almost secretive because it's done on private lands, it's very hard to curb.
All right, thank you very much. If we don't have any other comments, then I'd like you, Catherine and Professor Reto, to do the closing remarks in 2 minutes each, and then that will be the end of the webinar.
Right. So I think my closing remark on charcoal is that a lot of governments feel powerless to control its impact, because if you look at the way land tenure is in most of Africa, land is private, and it's usually up to the landowners to do the planting or to do the maintenance of their private land. So the landowners, just as they choose to produce charcoal, can also choose to replant trees. So some of their barriers are lack of resources, and really it's a big business, and some of them are nomadic, so they go from one land to another to really just produce charcoal. So there is a very there's a big interest. There should be an interest in landowners to plant trees because it really helps the nation. Although this has to be heavily facilitated by government because they do have the resources, but they don't own the land. So the landowners would really benefit from really collaborating with the public sector in terms of reforestation.
All right, Professor Reto.
Well, I enjoyed the question or the comment from Deng. Thank you so much. And perhaps what the governments can do is enforce some labeling, but clearly that depends on the country as well. But if you go to a supermarket in, let's say, in Europe or the US, it would be easy to just introduce labeling that tells you where it's coming from, how it is sourced, and what are the dangers. But if charcoal is traded in a local market, it's usually not existing. So it's hard to reach the population, the general population. But I think through education, we can at least raise awareness of the problems of charcoal, both on the health side and also on the sustainability of the forest areas. And that would help. It is a long process, and especially because also charcoal is such a convenient fuel.
All right. Thank you very much, Professor Reto, and thank you very much, Catherine. This has been a very great webinar. And our participants, please take note. This is part of the African Energy Transition book launch, and the chapter will be available in our book. And not forgetting the fact that the video will also be featured in the book. So feel free to share the link to the video with all our other colleagues who haven't been able to make it. And feel free if you have any questions with respect to charcoal use in Africa or globally, feel free to reach out to Professor Reto and also Catherine, Miss Catherine Nabukalu. Again, thank you very much. This marks the end of our webinar, and I thank you for your participation. Tomorrow's webinar will be at 12:30 UK time, and the focus will be on the barriers to energy transitions in Africa. And we're having experts from Egypt, Nigeria, and also Kenya joining us. So please take note and do join us. Thank you very much and have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So much.